Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Lardner, and thanks for being here for another episode of Connecting the Dots, the Making of Meaningful Metrics, where we look at translating assessment information into meaningful metrics in the helping professions. Today, I'm very excited, we have a great conversation about how AI can help us better support children and families. And in order to discuss that, I have two of my favorite people from the University of Kentucky, Dr. Olga Vsevolozhskaya and Dr. Sharon Tong. Now, this is certainly a topic that's been in the news lately. A lot of the conversations around AI are related to those large language models that can help us predict the next word in a sentence to respond to our questions or to help high schoolers do their homework. But we're going to take a slightly different approach and look at some of the data analytics that people are doing to help support decisions around services, decisions around how agencies and systems can better work with kids and families in our systems. As always, if you're new to this If Center Live kind of YouTube series, we'd like to hear from you. So say hello in the chat, and also use that chat throughout the conversation to ask questions or make comments. We'll be tracking it throughout and hopefully be able to answer any of the questions that you put in there. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to please welcome my two guests today, Dr. Olga and Dr. Sharon. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
All right.
Glad to be here.
Good to see both of you. So let's jump right in. Now, I know this kind of conversation came about in Olga when we were speaking about the way people traditionally look at change over time using our CANS information. And in conversation with you, you're describing some of the flaws in that or some of the techniques that maybe don't really help us understand what's going on as well as we could. And so let's maybe start there. Can you talk us through the way people currently look at this change over time and, why maybe there's potentially another way to approach this?
Yes, absolutely. So in these slides, I produce graphs that a lot of people make whenever they're trying to capture changes in the CANS scores over time. So what you can see here are the changes between the initial assessment, the ever assessment, and the last assessment in terms of total actionable items across the two domains. So here we see life functioning and risk behaviors by different age groups and by different clinical level of needs. So pink here is the lowest level of need, and the blue one is the highest level of need. So those plots are quite typical for different dashboards, reports, or publications. And typically, the way people try to capture change is, for instance, the difference between the initial assessments and the last assessments. Here, a negative slope or a decline in total actionable items would be indicative of the improvement. However, if we look at the pink lines and look at the slope between the first and the last assessment, we can see that it is either zero, so it's a flat line, or it is even a little bit positive, which means that instead of an improvement, we have some indication of worsening. So typically, looking at the difference between the initial assessments and the last assessments does not really reveal an improvement because the net reduction is effectively zero.
I see. And so this would be what I would typically look at, and something I think even we talked about with John early on a couple months ago when we were discussing this change over time or total actionable items idea. Now, the important thing here is that, when I'm looking at this, obviously to me, this looks like change. Like, oh yeah, we're seeing those slopes, things are getting better. But if you look at that scale, I mean, this is really not a ton of change when you think about it, right? Because you're moving one item, maybe one number on an item lower. And that is, for many people, that might even be interpreted as a little bit discouraging, right? Olga or Sharon, that this feels like, well, I'm doing all this work, we're actually seeing real change. Measuring it this way is really not showing the impact that I'm having.
Yes, absolutely. And I understand how it can be discouraging. And that's why today we'll be talking about other possibilities of measuring change.
Sure.
Um, a quick idea that we can get from those plots, though, is that if we look at the highest scores and the last scores, we can see that slope quite a bit steeper. So we do have quite a bit more evidence for the improvement. However, sometimes even that doesn't really work. So next slide. What you see here is basically the same type of information as in the previous slide, but instead of looking at the total number of actionable items per subject, I am looking at the difference in scores for each single item. And the difference is defined, just as we talked a second ago, between the largest score versus the last score. If I define the difference this way, that means a positive difference means an improvement, and a negative difference means worsening. So, what we can see here is that over time, some of the items they score below the zero line, which means on certain items we have a regression. However, the majority of items they score above the zero line, which means overall, on an average, items the scoring on the items tend to improve. And this particular idea is reinforced by this black solid line. So with this black solid line, it just visually guides you as a slope of the improvement over time. And if the slope is positive, that means that improvement is present. However, once again, if we actually look at the magnitude of that slope, for instance, in the bright pink, you can see the differences in the strength domain. Once again, in terms of the overall magnitude, that improvement is very small. It almost looks like you need to stay for 900 days in a system to only improve on an average by one score across various items. So once again, that particular way of capturing improvement is potentially discouraging because it shows you that improvement is very minimal and it takes a lot of time to attain it.
Yeah. So yeah, looking at this and seeing that scale on the bottom. So you're counting in days, it looks right, or up to from 0 to 1,200 potential days that people might be in a system or getting support. Yeah, those lines look real flat to me, right? And so, and I know in your work that you and Sharon are doing that you are not the only ones who are finding this phenomena, correct? That the change measured traditionally doesn't really, while you can see some positive a movement, it's not what would we expect or something that really does tell us a lot about how people are changing.
Absolutely. So if we use the traditional regression techniques to try to capture improvement as a slope over time, either as a positive slope in this particular slide, where we're talking about per item change, or a negative slope if we're talking about changes in total actionable items, unfortunately, the slopes are typically very close to zero. So in the next slide, I show you an article that was published only about a year ago, so this is very recent, and it's a systematic review, which means that authors they look through multiple CANS publications and they try to summarize what were the findings? What were the findings in terms of improvement over time? And unfortunately, even in the very last sentence of an abstract, they say that they found no evidence of improvement or no significant change in CANS scores over time.
Right. So anyway, yeah, I'm having read that article that you just put up there, right? So those systematic reviews, they were looking at, I think it was 7 or so systems, and looking at their assessments across all those, and trying to take a broad perspective. And So that's not to say that individuals within those systems weren't showing improvement. Just overall across the systems, when you're looking at all those TAN scores, that for most of those domains you're not seeing improvement. And certainly, uh, while I imagine if I were in that system, I might find utility in using the like a tool like the cans to help me in my work day to day, to help me make some decisions, maybe track the change over time with that child or that family or that adult. But I would want that work to be understood at the aggregate level as well, right? So it's not just about, well, if it works for me, but really, can it help the system understand how people change? Can it help the system make better decisions? So certainly in reading that, that's a bit concerning, right? Like that we have, or that's a challenge maybe to try to figure out, is how do we maybe try something different to better understand change? And I think that's where you and Sharon maybe started from, to try to figure out, well, when then, if not this, then what's next?
Exactly, because I do not disagree with the results of that particular systematic review. However, well, let me step back. On the surface, what they're saying is true. But basically, what they're saying is that regular linear regression is not able to capture the change. So it doesn't mean that the change is not there or the improvement is there. It's just the traditional statistical techniques are failing to measure it. And that really thinks that that means that we really need to think hard outside of the box of how to look at the data in a totally different way to reveal that improvement to the practitioners, because it's there. However, with a regular regression and a summary of like a slope over time, unfortunately, it's just masked by something else.
Okay, so that's perfect then. So that's our challenge. So if
Right.
the
So this is
traditional
our
measures aren't
challenge.
working, all right, so
Right.
then what do you do?
We decided to do something drastically different, which I'm very excited about because I think it really gives us a different perspective on the data that we are working with. So, what we did in the regular linear regression, kind of like in the slides that I showed you before, you have the response on the y-axis, you have your predictor on an x-axis, and you try to summarize the relationship by trying to model some sort of a slope over time. We are doing right now something totally different. So, first of all, we are trying to look at the change for per subject as something captured in a multidimensional space. So let me try to explain it a little bit more. For each single subject, we have changes over multiple items. Say items in the core domains, about 50 to 60 items. In the example that I will show you in just a second, we were measuring change over 58 items. Each single change, it's just a number, right, per item.
Right.
So you can think about it as a coordinate. So for instance, if a change on item 1 is 1, item 2 is 0, item 3 is yet another 1, I have a set of 1, 0, 1 that can be thought of coordinates in a three-dimensional space with like x, y, and z axis. Obviously, with 58 items, we are talking about 58 axes, which means that each single person is represented by a point in a multidimensional space. So then changes for all of the individuals, they form this cloud in the multidimensional space. And what we want to do, we want to find some sort of a structure in this cloud. We want to see different trajectory of change and see whether some subjects improve faster, some subjects improve slower, but we are not approaching it as a regression, but we are approaching it as trying to find a structure in a very high multidimensional space. And then we are trying to use AI to help us find that structure, because obviously with naked eye, we cannot even visualize 58 dimensions. So we're using this what's called non-supervised machine learning techniques to try to find structure.
Okay, so this is, and this is fascinating, because what we're moving towards, or what you're moving towards, is a space where I do have to. It's a leap of faith a bit, right? So there's prior regression type models when I can map that curve. I can, my brain can make sense of that. I can think, well, that's what I was doing anyway. I weight certain items in my head when I meet with people. I think this is what I'm really tracking with them over time. If I can graph that out, I can say, well, yeah, I understand how that works. That makes sense. What you're asking us to do, or asking the machine to do, is say, well, let's try to do something that we can't do on our own, which is to think about all 58, to try to put those in some three-dimensional space, and to think about how that movement occurs for all of them at once, right? So, all right. So
Correct. But, and this will be my next slide, we definitely want to step away from the black box idea of AI. We want to make sure that whichever the results and AI spit out back to us, they make sense. So prior to applying those AI techniques, we try to examine the data before we do anything like that. So here is a slide where we are trying to visualize that multidimensional cloud in a two-dimensional space. So just as you can think of as a three-dimensional scatter plot, or something like a three-dimensional object, like this pen is a three-dimensional object in the room where I'm sitting. However, we can project this pen on the screen, on the one that is in front of you, and it's two-dimensional. So if we look at the pen this way, we see a line. If we look at the pen this way, we only see a dot. So we can look at this multi object that has a volume in a high dimensional space just on a kind of like a 2D sheet of paper. And this is what we are trying to do with these plots. So on the top row, you have something that is called PC1, PC2, and PC3. The same thing on the kind of Y vertical axis. And what we do is PC stands for principal components. And with principal components, we're trying, you can be thought of a multidimensional scaling tool. Multidimensional scaling is, once again, it's a way to visualize a high dimensional object on a 2D plane, to try to see a structure in the data prior to us applying AI. So the three plots that you should really focus on this particular slide is the one that has the lines. Can you all see the kind of tilted vertical lines? And then kind of like a scatter of points right below it. So, yep, right here. So what we're looking at here, it's the same data. Every point in this plot represents a change per subject or per person. And you have lots of points because this is a historical data with lots of children. Those plots represent the same multidimensional cloud just by how I was rotating the pencil to look at it from different direction. We are doing the same thing with the data. So whenever you see the lines, it's kind of, we're looking at the data this way, but a scatter right below it, it's almost like I moved my camera or my point of view a little bit different. And once again, I'm projecting to the screen and trying to understand what the data looks like. So you can see a little bit of lines also in PC1 versus PC3. So that kind of a structure is visible in one of those plots, but on the total scatter, that just means yet another rotation of that cloud that completely removed the vertical lines. Now, the vertical lines, speaking of them, typically, whenever we looked at any random data, you will never see that very, very rigid structure. This is very, very atypical to see. So whenever Shairan and I first looked at those graphs, we were perplexed. We were afraid that potentially we made a mistake. And then we realized that those lines is it's something that we artificially, in a way, created with the data. Obviously, something that is very tightly connected to improvement is the length of stay in the system. Something that you saw one of the previous plots, whenever, for instance, a subject can stay in a system up to 1,200 days. However, whenever you give to any AI program large numbers, like, no, Josh, previous slide still. uh, Previous slide, please. Yeah, we're still here. Very large numbers like 1,200 or 900 or 800, the system tends to be numerically unstable. Because we knew of that numerical instability ahead of time, we decided to categorize length of stay by chopping it into the 6 months intervals. And chopping it into the 6 months intervals created those particular kind of vertical lines that are tilted. So once we thought about it, we were actually quite happy, because that means that, well, data represents that structure that we kind of just created artificially. Next.
So let me make sure I'm following what you're saying.
Yeah.
So first, these graphics that we're looking at, these are two-dimensional kind of images, but of like three-dimensional constructs.
Multi-dimensional. Here,
Multi-dimensional.
it's like 58 dimensions, actually,
Well,
plus one more. The
made
length
up of those 58 and 59, though, because then you're acknowledging that not only the 58 cans items that are in there, but also then the length of stay is
Correct.
one of those variables. But you took that length of stay, and compared to the prior slide when we saw it as, from 0 to 1,200, you took that and you grouped that into 6-month increments. And so that really then brings you down to, if you're 6 months at a time, there's roughly 6 or 7 potential options for that. And that's where those lines are, that somehow the data is grouping around those length of time in care or length of time in service.
Right, exactly. Now, that may not sound that excited, but we were actually very excited, because we artificially created a construct for length of stay for 6 months. And we can easily visualize that in a multidimensional space. That means that we have created a clustering among subjects where they stayed for 6 months, 1 month, 6 months, a year and a half, and so forth. So the structure that we created artificially, potentially, can be visually seen and visually interpreted. Right. That means that we can keep on digging further into this graph to get additional insights of what we have in our data prior to applying an AI technique, so then the AI results make sense.
Great.
Next slide. So this slide just shows you that we double check the idea that each single line represents a different length of stay in the system. So it's exactly same graphics. On the left, you just see what we were talking, the plot that we were discussing on the previous slide. On the right, every single, as I said, dot represents an improvement of a subject, and we colored it by the length of stay. And you can see we have like this perfect separation. Which means every line is exactly one color. So that means exactly that the length of stay, that's what's determining those lines.
Right.
Now, it's kind of obviously makes sense, as we discussed, that improvement is tightly related to the length of stay. But is there anything else that is kind of that we can deduce from this particular plot? And the answer is yes.
I think it's especially important to try to do something else, like you suggested, because simply determining how long people will stay connected to the supports or their services, their interventions they're getting, while useful, it's not actually all that useful in trying to make decisions about how we help people. And I think really in looking at this, something you and I had talked about before, when you look at the top of those lines, you can see, especially if our x-axis there is length of time, that there are a group of people where we certainly have questions about why it would take one person to achieve a level of change in a 6-month time frame versus another person who would take 18 months to achieve the same level of change. And there's got to be something going on there that we can start to understand, so we can support that transformational process better.
Exactly. I, you're absolutely right. And I want to kind of chime into that to say what it would mean if only length of stay was driving the improvement, if there were no other factors but the length of stay. If that was the fact, the lines that we would see would be absolutely horizontal.
Right.
So what we see here, so first of all, as we go kind of from the right to the left, because on the right, these are the children that stayed for 6 months, and on the very far left, these are the longer. So we know that going kind of from right to left is associated with higher level of improvement. And if the lines were completely vertical, that means that you stay for 6 months or you stay for 1 year, so forth, you always achieve the same level of improvement. But because they're tilted, that means that some children stay for 6 months and their improvement is faster than some other children that stay for the exactly same amount of time. So we control here for the length of stay, but their level of improvement is actually not the same. So we have this variability in the improvement other than length of stay, which is represented by the tilt of the lines. And that's quite exciting that we can just simply deduce it from that graphic. Although maybe it's not such a simple deduction, but that's what it represents.
Well, it helps when you explain it, no doubt.
Yeah. Let's look at the next slide. Here, it's actually a simulated data set that Dr. Tan simulated, reinforcing the idea that I was talking about vertical lines. So here, the only factor that was driving improvement was the length of stay. And as you can see, all of those lines are perfectly vertical without a tilt. So it's just we use some empirical methods and data simulation to make sure that our interpretation of the previous picture is actually what we think it is.
Great.
So next slide. Okay, and finally, after that, once we kind of understood what our data tells us or structure that potentially is there, we applied an AI to try to see whether we can identify different trajectories of improvement. Now, AI is a very, very broad term, and they also can be, I guess we can say, machine learning. There are two broad ways to do machine learning. One is called supervised machine learning, other one is called non-supervised machine learning. Here we used a non-supervised machine learning, which means that we are looking for the different pathways towards improvement. However, we do not know what these pathways may be. So we asking the machine to find a structure for us without guiding it in the first place. So that's what means an unsupervised machine learning. And what the best solution that we saw was three distinct trajectories towards the improvement. The method that we used, unsupervised machine learning, it's called finite Gaussian mixture. However, I think the majority of people on this call are very familiar with latent class analysis. Latent class analysis is an also type of unsupervised machine learning, and it could have been used to try to identify different trajectories of improvement as well. We tried it. We are not showing you these results just because they were not quite as good as the Gaussian mixture. So the main result here is actually summarized once again within the plot that has the stripes, the tilted vertical lines. Now, as you can see, they are painted by three different colors. That means that machine identified three different pathways to improvement that we observe in our current data. And we can call it like, say, pink class, blue class, and green class. So how do we interpret that particular plot? If you look at the first tilted line, it is blue and pink. We already discussed that kind of going from left to right, that means higher level of improvement. So what it means is that this first line represents all of the children that only stayed in a system for half a year. and blue are those that improved slower than the ones that are pink. Then if you see at the next line, there is still a little bit of pink. So we can summarize pink as children that stay in a system no longer than 1 year, and they improve at a relatively fast pace. The blue ones are the set of children that stay in the system for about 2 years. However, there is a delay in their improvement rate. And especially if you can try to kind of draw visually a vertical line, say, Josh, maybe you can help me with your mouse. So try to draw a line, say that going from the fourth tilted line. So the top of the fourth tilted line all the way down. Yep, from here down, like exactly. No, like vertically, exactly down. You can see that the top of the fourth line, which is blue, aligns with the bottom of the second line, which is pink. And what it means is that for those blue children, it took them 2 years to achieve the same level of improvement as for the pink children, but only in 1 year. So there's definitely a delay there. Moreover, you can see that the blue color up on the top, it's kind of carved out and fades away. And then we only have green. So what that means is that those children potentially are getting frustrated because they are not really see the rate of improvement that they wish to achieve. And it looks like potentially we are losing them. They're just like fading away from the system. And then finally, there is a green group of children that stay in the system the longest, and then they improve.
So just so I can kind of reflect back, so this is where you had taken the last analysis, right, and said, okay, we figured out some, the analysis helps us kind of group these things together, understand that in our data set, we can tell there's some differences based on how people cluster based on length of time and care. And then in this analysis, you've asked it to kind of produce how the computer would then sort those into different groups beyond the lines that we're seeing there, right? And so those different colors are the different groups of people where they say these people are unique in some way or would fit together in some way.
Exactly. And this is drastically different from a traditional approach whenever you just try to summarize an improvement as some sort of a slope over time. Here, we first of all look at the data totally different. We visualized it in this multidimensional space. And then once visualizing it, instead of the regular X and Y axis, this is totally different approach. We'll try to see, okay, if there is a distinct patterns towards the improvement. And looks like, yes, we do have 3 different distinct patterns.
So if I'm working at an agency or I'm at a system level and I say, okay, so this is going to help me better understand these distinct patterns and how people are changing over time, I might want to see, well, which of these groups of the youth or that family or that individual coming in to our system, which of them do they fit into, and how does that inform the decisions we're going to make, especially at that front door, about how we're going to try to work with them. And so is that our next step here, or how do we get from where we are now to that?
Yes, exactly. You exactly captured our next steps. So this project is very, very new. It's only a couple of weeks old, just trying to think about the data differently. But once we identify 3 different distinct pathways towards improvement, what we can do, we can use what's now called supervised machine learning techniques. Supervised now comes because we already identified 3 different groups. And basically, whenever a new child is coming into the system, we can use their initial assessments to predict or try to project about, well, are they going to be blue children or are they going to be happier pink children?
Okay.
What would be their expected length of stay? And then also, even with the historical data, we can try to understand, well, what made the blue children blue? Why were they not improving? We were only using cans so far to try to find that substructure. However, we have other information. We have information about like the intensity and the amount of services received. We have information about their diagnosis. We have information about their demographics. So basically, we can bring in new children level information to try to understand not only, okay, you come in and you are likely to be blue, but what can we do to make sure that you are not one of those blue children, but a pink child, so that your rate of improvement is much faster?
I think, again, I think this the vision I have, and to kind of maybe get back to the place we started our conversation about how AI impacts our helping systems. It's not one in which all the people who do the clinical work are being replaced by chat bots and things of that nature, but that we're building data systems, data dashboards that allow people to kind of to see these visualizations, to try to apply them to the decisions they're making, and perhaps have that be an ongoing iterative process. So for this all, in the way I typically think about this, I'd be curious about your and Sharon's thought about this, is that for agencies, for systems, the vision of who's sitting around that table, that the professional table, the people working within the system, that's not just people with clinical backgrounds potentially, right? That's people with some backgrounds in this type of math that helps that conversation get started about how are we going to inform these models and design these things to help us improve, to help us better serve people. I think maybe there is some room there for us to kind of stretch our thinking. I think there's a lot of work in this area already. I mean, certainly we met with Scott last week, who's heavily invested in this, but that we really try to think about the clinical and the biostatistician or the math person as working in conjunction to create a system that actually supports or helps people achieve change.
I absolutely agree with you, because currently, as I told you, the literature or the general reports, if you look at the changes in cans over time, unfortunately, the net change is zero. And if you are a practitioner and you actually score in the cans, it's almost like, well, why am I doing it if
Mhm.
the net change in the end is zero? Where here we took a totally different approach, and we do see that children, on an average, are improving. Some of them improve faster, some of them improve slower. We can try to project what is a possible pathway for that particular child within the system if nothing, if no interventions, if no additional interventions were to be delivered. And a much more important next step is like, how can we move that point from like one, how can we make blue pink?
Right, right, right. And I think again, there's a comment from Renee Goodwin in here too, which I think is an important point, was that we're no longer having to answer questions just based on what we can hold in our brain, or based on the kind of the biases that we have around what matters and what doesn't, as we think about a comprehensive assessment of the people we serve, but rather we can get support to do that, and with some of this analysis that potentially eliminates some of the bias in how we perceive or understand information, and actually points us towards things that we would not be able to conceptualize just because of the mere, the scope of how many different variables we're trying to consider at once. That this might support us to do this work.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
We as humans, we can do some preliminary steps to try to understand that data in a multidimensional space. And that was our initial graphs. We were like, okay, what does it mean? Does it make any sense or not? But then still that carving of different colors, it wasn't just like, you know, clear vertical horizontal lines. It was quite intricate where, that type of pattern was
mhm.
able to be detected by a machine that without a machine, we would not be able to cluster trajectories of improvement in that particular fashion. And obviously, we tried other solutions. So what about if it's more trajectories other than 3 or 4 or 5? And, the 3 one ended up being the best one. And that's what we showed you.
Yes. All right. So this conversation certainly is the start of like several more conversations. So I think the next place it would be great to talk to you guys about, and we'll have to set up another time for you and Sharon to come back. Sharon, maybe next time you can take the lead on helping us think about how this impacts these decision support models that are in use. I know that you have a lot of expertise in discussing that, and I think most systems still, especially a number that I'm working with, still use these kind of clinical-based best practice models. Some that are slightly tested, but tested mostly using kind of that old way of thinking, that linear regression models. So this kind of approach applied to decision support models, actually think opens up tons of doors for how we make those decisions and how we better understand how to support people achieving outcomes. So I want to thank you both. We're a bit over time, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to continuing.
I want to see my last slide.
Okay, so your last slide. I apologize.
Yes,
here we go.
because this work would not be possible if I were to do it by myself or I were to do it with Sharon only. We have a great team. So Sharon and I are faculty at the Biostatistics department. However, we have great data analysts, our senior data analyst, Michaela, and our other 2 data analysts, Wiley Turner and Jordan McAllister. So I really want to give a shout out. How do you say it in English? I want to give applause to my team, because it was all achieved as a group work.
Great. All right. Well, then this is a good group of people. We'll definitely have to have you and all of them back. It looks like a fun crowd. Maybe next time I can come to you and we can meet wherever you're meeting and enjoy a drink and discuss this stuff further. But thank you both again. I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to where this is going.
Can I make a quick comment? I noticed Tim Fall commented that there were more beer on that picture than the number of people. Hey, whenever you look at tilted vertical lines and you try to think, what does it mean? Sometimes beer helps.
There you go. So, all right. Well, thank you both. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, everyone who participated, who joined this If Center Live on YouTube. I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate the comments you made. Certainly, this will get posted with some comments and links to some information over the next couple of days. Our next session is going to be, or our next event is April 11th. We will be talking with Dr. Gavin Rain about that organic hold on the data. Please like and subscribe if you're able to. Click on that like button and subscribe. That's the best way to stay up to date on all the stuff happening with this episode or this show, Connecting the Dots, and all the other things going on YouTube or on the TCOM channel. Thank you for being here. Have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you next time on Connecting the Dots.